The first thing Ethan noticed on the divorce ledger was that the biggest debt in Adrian Vale's past had already been paid, and not by Adrian. 3 hours earlier, Adrian had looked across a polished conference table and called his husband a gold digger. He had said it quietly, which somehow made it worse. "You married me because you knew what my name was worth." Ethan had stared at him for a long second, then pushed the unsigned settlement back toward Adrian's attorney. "Then this should make things easy," he said. "I don't want your house. I don't want your company's shares. I don't want the apartment in Manhattan. I want the divorce." Adrian's expression had barely changed, but the line of his jaw tightened. He was used to people negotiating with him. Suppliers negotiated. Investors negotiated. Competitors negotiated until Adrian made them regret it. Ethan had spent 6 years learning that the fastest way to unsettle his husband was to refuse to bargain. Now the two attorneys sat between them with folders spread across the table, converting 6 years of marriage into assets, liabilities, valuations, and signatures. Ethan hated how clean it looked on paper. There was no column for the nights he had slept on hospital waiting room chairs beside Adrian's father. No line item for the years he had quietly rearranged his life around Adrian's emergencies. No field marked trust, damaged beyond valuation. There were only numbers. Adrian's attorney, Ms. Mercer, turned another page. "Before we finalize the marital balance sheet, there's an issue with a historical liability." Adrian glanced at his watch. "What issue?" "A personal guarantee attached to Vale Meridian Holdings. 8 years ago, principal and penalties together were just under $4.8 million. Ethan's fingers stopped against the edge of his folder. Adrian looked up. "That was resolved before the restructuring." "Yes," Mercer said. "That's the problem." She slid a document toward him. "Your records show the debt was paid in full 14 months before the restructuring closed." Adrian's eyes moved over the page. "So, the payment didn't come from you." The room changed. Not dramatically. No one gasped. No glass shattered. But Adrian's stillness sharpened. "That's impossible. We checked your personal accounts, the Vale family office, the corporate accounts, and the bridge financing facility. None funded this payment." Ethan lowered his gaze before anyone could look at him. He had spent years believing silence was the cleanest form of love. Give without announcing it. Help without creating obligation. Never turn devotion into a receipt someone had to acknowledge. It had seemed noble once. Sitting across from a man who believed he had married for money, it felt less noble now. It felt like disappearing. Mercer continued. "The creditor received 3 transfers over 11 days. The originating account was closed shortly afterward." Adrian leaned back. "Then find out whose account it was." "We did." Ethan looked up. Mercer was no longer looking at Adrian. She was looking at him. Adrian followed her gaze. For the first time since the meeting began, something broke through his controlled expression. Not guilt. Not yet. Confusion. "Ethan." Ethan said nothing. Adrian gave a short, disbelieving laugh. "No. Whatever you think you found, that doesn't make sense." Mercer pulled a second sheet from the file. The account was held by North Harbor Custodial Services on behalf of a private beneficiary. "Whose beneficiary?" Adrian asked. Mercer hesitated just long enough to make Ethan's stomach tighten. "The identifying tax number belongs to Ethan." Silence settled over the table. Adrian looked at Ethan as though he had switched places with someone else. "You paid that debt." Ethan's attorney shifted beside him, but Ethan answered before she could. "I'm here to end a marriage, Adrian. Not reopen an old accounting file. $4.8 million is not an old accounting file. It was paid. By you." Ethan closed his folder. "Does it matter now?" Adrian stared at him. "You spent the last 6 years letting me think you had nothing when we met. That landed almost as badly as gold digger." Ethan's expression hardened. "No, you decided I had nothing. Those are different things." Adrian opened his mouth, then stopped. That was the first real shift of power in the room. Ethan felt it because Adrian did not have an immediate answer. Mercer looked down at the records again. "There's another issue." Ethan's pulse kicked once. He knew the debt would eventually surface if the divorce became forensic enough. He had not expected this. "What issue?" Adrian asked. Mercer laid down a transaction summary. "The $4.8 million wasn't a loan from Ethan to you. There's no promissory note, repayment schedule, security interest, or reimbursement agreement. In fact, a waiver was filed that prevented the payment from becoming a collectible claim against you. Adrian read the page twice. Why would anyone do that? Ethan stood. His attorney touched his wrist lightly, a warning not to walk out before the session formally ended. He stayed standing anyway. We can finish the settlement tomorrow. Adrian's voice sharpened. You're not answering me. You didn't ask me before you decided who I was. Ethan, you called me a gold digger this morning. His voice remained calm, but this time he let Adrian see what the words had done. If I show you receipts now, does that make 6 years of being mistrusted disappear? Adrian's face changed, just slightly. It was the first time shame threatened to replace anger. But before either man could speak, Mercer turned another page and frowned. There's more. Ethan looked at her. He genuinely did not know what she meant. Mercer traced a line with one finger. The payment account didn't receive enough cash from income to cover those transfers. The money came from liquidation proceeds. Adrian's attention snapped back to the file. Liquidation of what? Mercer pulled a property record from beneath the ledger. An asset owned solely by Ethan before your marriage. Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. Adrian reached for the page. Mercer did not hand it over immediately. Mr. Vale, you should understand the timing first. Ethan's asset was sold 17 days before your first creditor payment. 11 days after the final payment cleared, the lender withdrew its claim against Vale Meridian. Adrian's eyes lifted slowly. What asset? Mercer finally placed the document in front of him. Ethan watched Adrian read the address. Then read it again. The color drained from his face. Ethan knew that property had value. What he had never known was whether Adrian would ever understand what selling it had cost him. Mercer looked from the property record to the old corporate file and said, almost to herself, this is strange. Adrian's voice was low now. What? She turned one final page. If that debt had not been paid when it was, you wouldn't just have defaulted. According to the security agreement, the lender would have taken control of the asset that later became the foundation of your entire company. Mercer's discovery did not stop the divorce, but it stopped Adrian from signing anything until he understood why the man he had called a gold digger had once stood between him and losing his company. By 9 the next morning, the settlement had changed. The simple stack of asset schedules was gone. In its place sat 2 archive boxes, a forensic accountant's report, and a formal notice that the historical payment had to be reconciled before Adrian could certify his financial disclosures. Ethan arrived expecting signatures. He found Adrian standing at the windows with his jacket off and his phone pressed to his ear. I don't care how old the records are, Adrian said. Find the original creditor file. He ended the call when Ethan entered. You knew what that debt was secured against. It was not a question. Ethan set his folder on the table. Good morning to you too. If the lender had taken that asset, Vale Meridian would have lost the distribution contracts attached to it. Then I guess it's fortunate they didn't. Adrian stared at him. Yesterday, he had looked at Ethan with suspicion. Today it was something more unstable, suspicion fighting evidence. Mercer interrupted before it became another confrontation. There's something both of you need to see. She handed Ethan's attorney a revised settlement schedule. Mr. Cole has declined the marital residence, the Manhattan apartment, any claim to Mr. Vale's privately held voting shares and spousal support. Adrian turned toward Ethan. You declined support? 3 weeks ago. Why wasn't I told? Mercer's expression stayed neutral. You were. It was in the preliminary response your office received. That silenced him. Ethan almost laughed, but there was nothing funny about it. Adrian had been so certain Ethan wanted his money that he had not bothered reading the document where Ethan refused it. There is one item Mr. Cole is requesting, Mercer continued. Adrian's mouth tightened. What? Ethan answered. My grandmother's watch. Adrian blinked. That's it. That's mine. Ethan, the settlement could be worth tens of millions. Then you should be relieved. Apparently you're divorcing the cheapest gold digger in Manhattan. The words hit harder than Ethan intended. Adrian looked away first. It was a small shift, but Ethan felt it. Yesterday, Adrian had controlled the accusation. Today, every new number seemed to turn it back on him. Mercer opened another file. There's a second problem. The waiver attached to the old debt was not standard. She slid forward a copy bearing Ethan's signature. It explicitly states that the funds were provided without expectation of repayment, ownership interest, future consideration, or claim against Vale Meridian. Adrian read it slowly. So he couldn't come back later and say the company owed him. Correct. Or use it in a divorce. Correct. Or claim equity. Correct. Adrian looked at Ethan. Why would you sign this? Ethan sat down. You keep asking questions as if the answers are going to make yesterday disappear. I'm asking because none of this makes sense. It makes sense. It just doesn't fit the version of me you preferred. Mercer's phone buzzed. She checked the message, then stood. The forensic accountant found the custodial statements. I need 10 minutes. She left with Ethan's attorney, giving them privacy neither man had requested. Adrian moved around the table, but Ethan closed his folder before he could reach the documents. Don't. Adrian stopped. Don't what? Don't suddenly turn this into concern. $4.8 million came from an account tied to you, and it was paid 8 years ago, before we were married. Ethan said nothing. Adrian caught it. That matters. Why? Because your accusation yesterday was that I married you for your money. Ethan's voice stayed level. If I was already paying your debts before there was a marriage, your timeline has a problem. Adrian flinched. It was almost invisible, but Ethan saw it. Then Mercer returned carrying a thinner folder. We found the custodial statements. She placed 3 transaction records side by side. The first matched the payment they already knew about. The second was smaller. The third made Adrian lean closer. What is that? A transfer to the same creditor 6 weeks earlier, Mercer said. It covered an interest shortfall and prevented the lender from accelerating the loan before the larger payment could be arranged. Adrian looked at Ethan. There were 2 payments. 3, Mercer corrected. The final transfer covered legal fees required to release the security claim. Ethan's attorney frowned. So without the first transfer, there might not have been time to sell the property. Exactly. The room went quiet again, but this silence was different. Yesterday's discovery could still have been explained away as one extraordinary act. 3 coordinated transfers meant planning, timing, intent. Adrian picked up the waiver. You arranged all of this. Ethan's eyes went to the signature at the bottom. He remembered the pen more clearly than he wanted to. Cheap blue plastic, borrowed from a clerk because his own hand had been shaking too badly to find the one in his coat. He pushed the memory away before it could take over. I arranged for the creditor to get paid. Why? Because there was a debt. That's not an answer. It's the only one you need for the divorce. Adrian's frustration returned, but it no longer carried the old authority. You don't get to drop nearly $5 million into my past and tell me I don't get to ask why. Ethan met his eyes. And you didn't get to reduce 6 years of my life to what you thought I wanted from your bank account. We're both discovering limits today. Mercer broke the silence. There's one more thing. She placed the custodial statement beside Ethan's proposed settlement. Mr. Cole's waiver means he cannot demand repayment under the old agreement. But the divorce disclosure has uncovered a separate issue. The account that funded those transfers received proceeds from more than one liquidation. Ethan's head turned sharply. More than one. Mercer nodded. That was new even to him. The custodial structure had been handled by an advisor after the property sale. The real estate proceeds covered most of the debt, she said. But not all of it. There was a second asset sold 11 days later. Adrian's face tightened. What asset? Mercer looked at Ethan before answering. We don't know yet. The original statement identifies it only by a transfer code. The archive request is pending. Adrian looked down at the numbers, then at the man he had accused of wanting his fortune. How much more did you give up? Ethan did not answer, because for the first time since the divorce began, he honestly didn't know what the records were about to uncover. Mercer turned to the last page of the custodial statement, and her expression changed. Actually, she said, we may have a bigger problem. This second liquidation wasn't made to cover the debt. It happened after the debt was already fully funded, and the money went somewhere else connected to Vale Meridian. The second liquidation had not paid Adrian's debt. It had bought him time. Mercer received the archive transfer confirmation 20 minutes later, and the destination was not another creditor. It was a small legal escrow account opened during the worst month in Vale Meridian's history. What was this for? Adrian asked. Mercer turned her laptop toward him. A cure payment. His expression hardened. For the distribution agreement? Apparently. She enlarged the scanned document. 8 years earlier, Vale Meridian had violated a liquidity covenant tied to its most important distribution network. The lender had already been preparing to seize the collateral, but losing the distribution agreement would have done something worse. It would have stripped the company of the contracts that made the collateral worth saving. Someone had deposited $620,000 into escrow 48 hours before the cure deadline. Ethan stared at the transfer code. He remembered the amount now, not the paperwork. The decision. That was you too, Adrian said. Ethan didn't answer. Mercer did. The beneficial owner identifier matches the custodial account we traced yesterday. Adrian sat down slowly. For 2 days, the records had been dismantling his version of the marriage one document at a time. Now they were dismantling his version of his own survival. So the $4.8 million kept the lender from taking control, he said. And this kept the distribution agreement alive. Mercer nodded. Which means the payments were coordinated. Ethan's attorney looked at him. You knew exactly what would happen if both weren't handled. Ethan's silence answered enough. Adrian pushed away from the table. You told me you knew nothing about corporate finance. No, Ethan said. I told you I didn't want to talk about it. The difference landed visibly. Adrian walked to the window, then turned back. Where did $620,000 come from? Mercer had already opened the supporting statement. That's what changes this again. She placed a single-page liquidation notice on the table. It wasn't real estate. It was a portfolio held in Ethan's name before he ever met Adrian. Municipal bonds, index funds, and shares from a family trust that had been distributing income to him since his 20s. Adrian stared at the total. You had a trust? A small one. That is not small. Compared with what you have now, it is. That isn't the point. Ethan's mouth tightened. It became the point every time you talked about money. Adrian looked as if he wanted to argue, but instead he reached for the old portfolio statement. That choice changed something between them. For once, he read before judging. The statement showed nearly everything had been liquidated, not borrowed against. Sold. The remaining balance after the escrow payment was less than $30,000. Mercer tapped the date. This happened before the property sale. Adrian looked up sharply. So he emptied the investment account first. Most of it. Then, when that wasn't enough to resolve the secured debt, the property was sold. The numbers created a sequence no accusation could survive. Ethan had not entered Adrian's life with nothing. He had systematically turned what he owned into cash while Adrian's company was collapsing. Why didn't this appear in any of the background reports my family ran before the wedding? Adrian asked. Ethan gave him a tired look. Listen to yourself. Adrian went still. Your family investigated me before we married, and somehow you're surprised I didn't volunteer every account I ever had. I didn't order that report, but you read it. Adrian didn't deny it. There it was again, the antagonistic force that had poisoned their marriage long before the insult. Money treated as evidence of character, wealth treated as permission to investigate, measure, rank. Ethan closed the portfolio statement. This is exactly why I never wanted any of this discussed. Because you thought I'd judge you for having money? Because you judge everyone according to what they want from yours. Adrian's face tightened, but this time anger never arrived. The documents had taken that weapon away from him. Mercer's assistant appeared at the doorway with another envelope. The creditor archive just came through. Mercer opened it and removed the original settlement instructions. She read the first page, then the second. We have confirmation. Of what? Adrian asked. Ethan was not merely the beneficial source of the funds. He personally authorized all 3 debt transfers and the escrow cure payment. There was no third-party benefactor, no family intermediary funding it behind him. She placed the signature pages in front of Adrian. He paid it. The statement should have ended the mystery. Instead, it changed it. Adrian looked at Ethan's signature from 8 years ago, then at Ethan across the table. You saved the company before we were even married. I paid bills that needed paying. Stop saying it like that. Adrian's voice cracked for the first time. Ethan's expression shifted, but he did not rescue him from the moment. Why? Because it makes it easier when sacrifice sounds romantic. Because I need to understand why. And I needed you to understand who I was without an audit. Adrian had no answer. Mercer continued examining the creditor file, and then paused at a handwritten reference beside the property liquidation. There's a source schedule attached to the sale. Ethan frowned. There shouldn't be. There is. She unfolded the scanned schedule. The property had not been an investment condo or a piece of commercial real estate. It was a waterfront building in Brooklyn, inherited through Ethan's mother, held entirely outside the Vale marriage. Beside the address was an appraisal from 8 years ago and another commissioned just 6 months earlier for an unrelated neighboring transaction. Mercer compared the numbers. Ethan, do you know what this property would likely be worth today? No. She turned the page toward him. The current estimated value was more than $12 million. Ethan stared at it without speaking. Adrian did too. The debt suddenly had a cost larger than the amount printed on the creditor statement. Ethan had not simply spent money. He had surrendered an asset that could have guaranteed his independence for the rest of his life. Adrian's gaze dropped to a notation beneath the original appraisal. What does owner-occupancy plan mean? Mercer read the attached summary. Her expression softened despite herself. Before the sale, there was an approved renovation permit. Residential space upstairs. Commercial space on the ground floor. Ethan reached for the paper too late. Adrian saw the next line first. Coal and heart. He looked at Ethan. What was that? Ethan's jaw tightened. It was the first question all morning he clearly did not want answered. Nothing. It had a business plan attached. Adrian, what were you going to build there? Ethan pulled the document toward himself. A life that didn't happen. No one spoke. The answer carried more weight than the $12 million estimate. Adrian finally understood that Ethan had not merely transferred wealth to save him. He had traded away a future of his own. Then Mercer turned to the last page of the creditor agreement, and the room shifted again. Wait. She compared 2 dates, then opened the Old Vale Meridian capitalization file. The lender wasn't the only party positioned to take control if Adrian defaulted. Adrian leaned forward. Who else? Mercer's eyes moved across the ownership schedule. One of your original investors had a contractual option to acquire the controlling interest the moment the lender accelerated. Adrian's face went blank. He knew the name before Mercer said it. Which investor? She looked directly at him. Your uncle, Richard Vale. Ethan stared at the page. Adrian didn't move. Mercer continued, quieter now. If Ethan hadn't made those payments, Richard wouldn't simply have watched Vale Meridian fail. He would have taken it from you. And according to this agreement, he had already signed the documents to do it. By noon, Richard Vale knew the divorce had uncovered the old control agreement, and his first move was to make sure Adrian could not see the rest of it. Mercer had barely finished explaining the signed takeover option when her phone rang. She listened for less than a minute before her expression hardened. Vale Meridian's archive counsel just froze external access to the restructuring files. Adrian stood. On whose authority? Richard's. He doesn't have that authority anymore. He still chairs the legacy trust that controls the pre-restructuring records. Mercer turned her screen toward him. The notice was already there. Privileged review pending, no documents released without trustee approval. 8 years ago, Richard had been positioned to take Adrian's company if the debt accelerated. Now, within hours of that fact resurfacing, he was using the one piece of institutional control he still possessed to close the archive. The threat was no longer historical. Adrian called him immediately. Richard answered on the third ring. You're making a mistake, he said before Adrian could speak. Release the files. Your divorce attorney has no business digging through dead transactions. You had a signed option to take my controlling interest, and you didn't default. Adrian looked across the conference room at Ethan. Because someone paid the debt. A pause. Small, but unmistakable. Be careful what story you build from old paper, Richard said. Old paper has signatures. So do divorce petitions. People sign foolish things when they're emotional. Adrian's grip tightened around the phone. Release the files. No, Richard hung up. For years, Adrian had treated control as proof of strength. Now someone else had used control to decide what truth he was allowed to see, and the resemblance was ugly enough that he could not ignore it. Mercer moved fast. We don't need the company archive for everything. The lender was independent. So was the escrow firm. I can subpoena both through the divorce discovery. Ethan's attorney immediately shook her head. Not without consequences. Once you expand discovery into corporate control, this stops being a quiet marital settlement. Board counsel gets involved. Auditors may get involved. If there was an undisclosed related party arrangement, it could trigger reporting obligations. There it was, the first consequence that could not be contained inside the marriage. Adrian's past debt was now capable of reaching his present company. Do it, he said. Ethan looked at him. Adrian, I need the records. You need them, Ethan said. Or you need to prove Richard was the villain so you don't have to look at what you did yesterday. Adrian went silent. Ethan gathered his papers. Don't turn him into an excuse for you. Then he walked out. Adrian did not stop him. That choice cost him more than chasing Ethan into the hall would have, because for the first time he understood that demanding an answer was not the same as earning one. 3 hours later, the independent escrow firm released its portion of the file. Mercer called Ethan back because his authorization appeared on every instruction. He returned reluctantly, this time sitting at the far end of the table. No confrontation, no accusations. Mercer simply placed a timeline on the screen. We can now reconstruct the final 72 hours before the cure deadline. At 9:14 Monday morning, Richard's attorney had sent notice that his purchase option would activate automatically if the lender accelerated. At 2:37 that afternoon, Ethan liquidated the last portion of his trust portfolio. Tuesday morning, he authorized the escrow transfer. Wednesday afternoon, the covenant was cured. Thursday, the lender suspended acceleration. Richard's option died before it could activate. Adrian stared at the timestamps. You knew about Richard. Ethan looked at the timeline rather than at him. I knew someone was waiting for you to fail. Why didn't you tell me? Because you already knew people were waiting for you to fail. Back then, you saw enemies everywhere. Ethan finally looked up. I wasn't going to become one more person telling you who to fear. Mercer slid another document forward. There's also correspondence from the escrow attorney. The email was addressed to Ethan. Its language was clinical. Confirmation that the cure funds would preserve Adrian's control only temporarily unless the secured debt itself was satisfied. In other words, Ethan had known the $620,000 transfer was not enough. He had emptied the portfolio knowing the property would probably have to go next. Adrian read the email twice. You knew you'd have to sell Brooklyn. Ethan's face closed. I knew it was possible. The place where you were going to open Cole and Hart. Don't. You had permits. A business plan. An apartment upstairs. I said don't. Ethan stood so quickly the chair rolled backward. This time Adrian did not press him. He looked down instead. That was the relationship shift Ethan noticed. Adrian had finally stopped when asked. It was small. It did not repair anything. But it was the first time in 2 days that power had been offered back rather than taken. Mercer broke the silence with another piece of evidence. The property sale closed below the appraised value. Ethan turned. How far below? Almost 18%. His attorney swore under her breath. Mercer continued. It was an accelerated private sale. 10-day close, no financing contingency. That discount alone cost you more than $700,000 at the time. Ethan sat again. He had known he sold fast. He had never calculated the loss. Adrian did. He seemed unable not to. For $0.8 million in debt payments. $620,000 for the cure. A forced sale discount. A property now estimated above $12 million. Every number made the word gold digger more obscene. Then the consequences reached the present. Mercer's phone lit up with a message from Vale Meridian's general counsel. She read it and looked at Adrian. The board has been notified that historical control documents are under discovery. They want an emergency governance review tomorrow morning. Adrian's face tightened. Because of Richard? Because if your company's survival depended on undisclosed outside funds, they need to know whether those funds created an ownership claim. They didn't, Ethan said immediately. Mercer nodded. The waiver supports that, which creates a different question. She placed Ethan's waiver beside the escrow instructions. Why would someone contribute enough money to preserve a company, waive every possible claim to that company, and then never tell the person whose control he saved? Adrian looked at Ethan, but this time he did not demand an answer. Mercer opened the final file the escrow firm had sent. There may be one. Inside was a memorandum prepared after the debt was cleared. The first page summarized the payments. The second confirmed Richard's option had expired. The third contained a projection of what would happen if Adrian retained the distribution network through the upcoming expansion cycle. Mercer scanned the numbers and stopped. This projection was remarkably accurate. Adrian moved beside her. The model showed that preserving control through those few weeks could allow Vale Meridian to enter 3 national markets. Those markets were the same ones that later transformed the company from a struggling regional operation into the core of Adrian's fortune. Adrian stared at the projection, then at Ethan. For the first time, the shape of the truth seemed obvious to him. Ethan had sacrificed millions to stop Richard from taking the company. That had to be the answer. That had to be the whole story. Then Mercer turned to the memorandum's signature page. No, she said quietly. Adrian looked at her. What? She pointed to the date. This projection was prepared before Ethan sold the Brooklyn property. Ethan's expression changed. Mercer looked from him to Adrian. He didn't sell it just to save you from default. He had already been shown what keeping control could make possible. Adrian's eyes returned to the future value projection. So he knew what the company might become. Mercer nodded slowly. Before he gave up the asset that could have secured his own future, yes. Adrian had spent 2 days asking how much Ethan had sacrificed to save him. The projection on Mercer's screen forced him to ask a worse question. How much of his fortune existed because Ethan had? Mercer pulled the original financial model closer. This wasn't a generic forecast, she said. It was prepared specifically for Vale Meridian's expansion plan. 3 national distribution markets, 2 logistics acquisitions, and the licensing structure that later became your highest margin division. Adrian stared at the numbers. They were old estimates, but the shape of them was painfully familiar. Who commissioned it? Mercer checked the engagement letter. Her eyes moved to Ethan. He did. Adrian looked up. Ethan's face gave nothing away. You hired an analyst? An independent restructuring consultant. Before you sold Brooklyn? Ethan said nothing. Mercer answered from the document. 9 days before. That changed the story again. Until now, Adrian had believed Ethan had acted out of panic, love, loyalty, some desperate attempt to stop him from losing everything. But Ethan had not been guessing. He had studied what Vale Meridian could become, understood exactly what preserving control might be worth, and still walked away from every claim to it. Mercer opened the model's appendix. There's more. The consultant ran 2 scenarios. One if Adrian retained control. One if Richard's option activated. Adrian leaned closer. The second scenario was brutal. Richard's plan assumed immediate sale of 2 operating divisions, elimination of the expansion program, and a rapid distribution of cash to investors. He was going to break the company apart, Adrian said. Yes, Mercer replied. The model predicts Vale Meridian would have survived as a shell, but the growth platform would have disappeared. Ethan finally spoke. Richard didn't care about the company. He cared about extracting value before anyone else could. Adrian's eyes fixed on him. You knew that too. I knew enough. So you weren't just paying my debt. Ethan's jaw tightened. No. The answer landed harder than any number. Mercer pointed to another page. The consultant estimated that if Adrian retained control and completed the expansion, the company could increase in value by 8 to 12 times over 7 years. She paused. It did better than that. Adrian sat down. His current fortune no longer looked like something Ethan had later tried to enter. It looked like something Ethan had once stood outside of, studied carefully, protected at enormous cost, and then deliberately refused to own. You knew this could make me rich, Adrian said. I knew it could keep your company alive. That isn't what I asked. Ethan met his eyes. Yes, I knew. Adrian glanced at the waiver beside the forecast. The timing was suddenly devastating. Ethan had seen the upside before signing away repayment. He had known what the company might become before refusing equity. He had sold the property that could have secured his own future after learning that Adrian's future might multiply. And years later, Adrian had looked at him across a breakfast table, a private club, a marriage counselor's office, and finally a divorce conference room, and reduced him to a man chasing money. Why didn't you take a stake? Adrian asked. Ethan's expression changed. Not softer, but more tired. Because then every good thing that happened to you would have owed me something. You could have taken 1%. I didn't want 1%. You gave up millions. I know. For nothing. Ethan's eyes hardened. That is the problem with you, Adrian. You hear nothing when there isn't a financial return. The word stopped him. Mercer looked down, suddenly very interested in arranging papers. Ethan continued, quieter. You were 31. Your father had just died. Richard was circling. Your board was terrified. Every person around you was telling you what part of yourself you needed to sell to survive. I didn't want to become another person holding a piece of you. Adrian's face went still. For the first time, the payment was no longer the center of the mystery. Ethan's motive was. He had protected Adrian's control precisely because he did not want control of Adrian for himself. Then why marry me later? Adrian asked. Because by then I thought you understood the difference. Ethan looked at the divorce papers. I was wrong. Mercer's phone vibrated. She read the message and exhaled. The board's governance review has expanded. Richard's counsel is claiming Ethan's funds were an undisclosed capital contribution and that the waiver may not eliminate equitable ownership arguments. Ethan's attorney immediately stood. That's absurd. The documents say the opposite. I agree, Mercer said. But if Richard can characterize Ethan as a hidden investor, he can force a formal review of the restructuring and potentially delay the divorce discovery while corporate counsel sorts jurisdiction. Adrian's expression changed instantly. He's using Ethan. He's using the ambiguity, Mercer said. The same ambiguity everyone else created by assuming Ethan had no money. Ethan looked at Adrian. Do not use this to delay the divorce. I wasn't going to. Ethan searched his face, clearly expecting the old Adrian, the one who treated control as protection. Adrian surprised him. He turned to Mercer. Make it clear to the board that Ethan claims no ownership. Give them the waiver, the source records, everything. And tell Richard's counsel I will testify under oath that Ethan never asked for equity, repayment, or consideration of any kind. Mercer nodded. That weakens Richard's argument. Good. Adrian then looked at Ethan. And I want the repayment figure calculated. Ethan's expression went cold again. No, Ethan, no. You sold property, liquidated investments, covered legal costs, absorbed a discount, and I signed a waiver. I don't care about the waiver. I do. Adrian stepped closer, stopping before the distance became pressure. I can't know this now and do nothing. Ethan's answer came immediately. That's because you still think money is the action. Adrian went silent. There was no contempt in Ethan's face anymore. That would have been easier. There was finality. You want a number because numbers are how you fix things, Ethan said. You acquire, settle, compensate, close. But you cannot reimburse me into trusting you again. The words changed Adrian's goal more completely than the documents had. Until that moment, he had been trying to reconstruct the past. Now the past was clear enough to hurt. Ethan had knowingly protected the foundation of the fortune Adrian later used to judge him. The question was no longer what Ethan had done. It was whether Adrian understood anything about how to repair what he had done. Mercer quietly slid the revised divorce calendar across the table. The final settlement conference is in 12 days. Adrian looked at the date. 12 days. That was all the time left between discovering the truth and legally losing the man who had once given up his own future to protect Adrian's. I'll repay every dollar anyway, Adrian said. Ethan picked up his coat. Then you still don't understand. Help me understand. Ethan stopped at the door. For a moment, Adrian thought he might answer. Instead, Ethan looked back at the fortune he had helped preserve, then at the husband who had mistaken love for dependence. You called me a gold digger because you thought money told you who had power in this marriage. His hand closed around the door handle. Now you know you were wrong about the money. The next question is whether you were wrong about the marriage too. Then he left, and Adrian stood beside a projection that proved Ethan had helped create the life he was accused of exploiting, with 12 days to learn how to offer something money could not buy. By the next morning, Adrian had a repayment package worth more than $6 million sitting and signed on his desk, and Ethan had already instructed his attorney to reject every cent. The refusal arrived at 8:07, before Adrian could even call him. No reimbursement for the original debt. No compensation for the forced sale loss. No interest. No replacement property. No equity. At the bottom, Ethan's attorney had added one sentence at his direction. Mr. Cole does not consent to converting past acts within the relationship into present financial obligations. Adrian read it twice. Then his phone rang. Vale Meridian's general counsel did not bother with a greeting. Richard withdrew the ownership claim. Adrian stood. That's good. No. He replaced it. Richard's new filing no longer argued that Ethan was a hidden investor. The waiver made that position too weak. Instead, he claimed Ethan had exercised undisclosed influence over a distressed company while personally connected to its founder, raising questions about whether the old restructuring had been properly disclosed to the board. It was clever. Richard had stopped trying to make Ethan an owner and started trying to make him a liability. He wants Ethan dragged into the governance review, Adrian said. Under oath, counsel replied. Financial history, communications, relationship timeline. Everything. Adrian's eyes moved to the rejected repayment package. 8 years ago, Ethan had protected him without asking for ownership. Now that sacrifice could become the reason Ethan's private life was dissected in a corporate proceeding. No, Adrian said. Keep him out of it. We may not be able to. Then use me. There was a pause. Adrian, that means accepting responsibility for any disclosure failures yourself. I was the founder. It was my company. Use me. That afternoon, Adrian walked into the board review alone. Richard attended by video, silver-haired and composed, looking exactly as Adrian remembered him from the year Vale Meridian nearly collapsed. Your husband's money preserved your control, Richard said. The board deserves to know what influence he received in return. Adrian placed Ethan's waiver on the table. None. That's what the document says. It's what happened. Richard smiled faintly. Then perhaps your husband was simply very generous. The insult was softer than gold digger, but Adrian recognized the mechanism now. Reduce a person's motives until money was the only explanation left. He had done the same thing. He is not appearing before this board, Adrian said. If you have questions about what I disclosed 8 years ago, ask me. Richard leaned closer to his camera. Protecting him now, Adrian did not answer the provocation. Taking responsibility now. The distinction mattered. For the first time, Adrian was not using power to keep Ethan close. He was using what power he had to keep Ethan from paying another price for him. By evening, the board agreed to limit the review to Adrian and the historical company records unless new evidence required Ethan's testimony. It was a temporary victory, and it cost Adrian something real. The governance committee formally noted that he had accepted personal responsibility for the old disclosure gap. But when Mercer told Ethan, his response was not gratitude. It was a request to meet. They chose a quiet conference room in Mercer's office, without the lawyers sitting between them. Ethan placed Adrian's repayment proposal on the table. You need to stop. Adrian looked at the unsigned pages. I thought refusing Richard access to you was what you wanted. That part wasn't the problem. A beat passed. Something had changed. Ethan was acknowledging the action even while refusing the solution. Then tell me what is. Ethan pushed the repayment package back. This. You lost millions because of me. I made a choice. A choice I benefited from. Yes. Then why won't you let me make it right? Ethan's eyes held his. Because you keep confusing repayment with repair. Adrian started to respond, but Ethan opened the old waiver between them. Do you know why I signed this? So I wouldn't owe you. Not financially. Ethan tapped the page once. At all. Adrian frowned. Ethan continued. When your father died, everyone around you wanted something. Richard wanted control. Investors wanted protection. The board wanted guarantees. You were terrified that every person who offered help would eventually present a bill. Adrian said nothing. It was true. I wanted there to be one person in your life who didn't, Ethan said. So I made sure you could never owe me for what I did. The answer closed a question Adrian had been asking since the first ledger appeared. Why hide the payment? Why waive repayment? Why sacrifice so much and leave no claim behind? Not because Ethan believed the money meant nothing. Because he wanted the love behind it to remain free of debt. Adrian looked down at the $6 million offer. Suddenly, it seemed less generous than desperate. And by paying you now, he said slowly, I turn it into the exact thing you were trying to avoid. Yes. Adrian closed the folder. He did not argue. Ethan noticed. Then what am I supposed to do? Adrian asked. That's still the wrong question. Why? Because you're asking me to design your apology. Ethan leaned back. You want instructions that guarantee an outcome. Pay this. Say that. Fix this. Get husband back. Adrian's face tightened. I'm trying. I know. That was the first kindness Ethan had offered him since the divorce began, and it hurt more than anger. But trying isn't the same as understanding. Adrian pushed the repayment papers aside. Then help me understand one thing. Why didn't you tell me when I started treating your contribution like it was nothing? Ethan was quiet for several seconds. At first, because I didn't want credit. Later, because I wanted to know whether you could value me without seeing a receipt. Adrian's expression changed. Ethan continued before he could speak. Every time you assumed your money gave you more weight in the marriage, I told myself it shouldn't matter. Every time you paid for something and called it taking care of us, I let you believe you were the only one who had ever done that. Why? Because somewhere along the way, I started believing that if I had to prove what I gave, then what I gave wasn't love anymore. Ethan looked at the waiver. That was my mistake. Adrian looked up. It was the first time Ethan had admitted any failure of his own, but it did not reduce Adrian's. It made the wound clearer. Ethan had protected the purity of his sacrifice by making himself invisible, while Adrian had filled that invisibility with suspicion. "So what happens now?" Adrian asked. Ethan slid a document across the table. It was the updated divorce schedule. "We stop pretending the truth changes the deadline." The final settlement conference had been moved forward. 9 days had become 5. "Why?" Adrian asked. "Richard's filings complicated the corporate discovery. My attorney petitioned to separate the marital settlement from it. The court agreed." Adrian stared at the new date. His attempt to uncover the truth had accidentally accelerated the ending. Ethan stood. "I'm still signing. Even now. Especially now." Adrian looked at him. "Why?" Ethan's voice was calm. "Because if the only reason you stop believing I'm a gold digger is that I finally produced enough financial evidence to prove otherwise, then we still have the same problem." He picked up his coat. "You know who paid your debts now. You know what it cost. You even know why I hid it." Ethan paused at the door. "What you still don't know is why I stopped needing you to believe me." Then he left Adrian alone with the rejected repayment package and a divorce date 5 days away, forcing Adrian into a new objective he could not solve with money. If he wanted any chance of saving what remained between them, he would have to prove he could respect Ethan's choice even if that choice was to leave him. 48 hours before the divorce was supposed to become final, Richard Vale made Ethan an offer designed to turn Adrian's worst accusation into a public fact. Mercer received the proposal at 6:20 in the morning. Richard would withdraw every governance challenge against Vale Meridian, close the historical review, and sign a permanent release protecting Adrian's control. In exchange, Ethan would accept a confidential $12 million settlement from a Vale family trust and sign a statement acknowledging that his old payments had been made with an expectation of future financial benefit from his relationship with Adrian. Ethan read the statement once. "He wants me to call myself a gold digger." In legal language, Mercer said, "Yes." Adrian was already reaching for his phone. Ethan stopped him. "Don't. He is trying to buy your signature. And you calling him in a rage changes what? I can shut this down." Ethan's expression hardened. "That sentence is exactly why we're here." Adrian's hand froze over the phone. Richard had chosen the pressure perfectly. If Ethan refused, the governance fight continued and Adrian's company remained exposed. If Ethan signed, Vale Meridian was protected, but the lie that destroyed their marriage would become part of the official record. "There's more," Mercer said. Richard had attached a deadline, noon. If Ethan rejected the offer, his attorneys would petition to compel Ethan's testimony and introduce the historical transfers into the board proceeding. Ethan's private finances, the Brooklyn property, the trust, and the timeline of his relationship with Adrian could all become evidence. Adrian looked at Ethan. "You are not signing that." Ethan folded the offer. "That's my decision." The words hit Adrian harder than Richard's threat. 5 days earlier, he would have answered by taking control. Now he forced himself to stay silent. At 11:54, Ethan signed only one page, the rejection. Richard filed his motion 6 minutes later. By early afternoon, Vale Meridian's board postponed approval of a major acquisition until the governance issue was resolved. The delay did not destroy the company, but it cost Adrian something measurable. Financing terms would worsen if the vote slipped another week, and the market could learn why. Richard had turned an 8-year-old sacrifice into present leverage. Adrian's general counsel called with the obvious option. "We can ask the divorce court for a continuance." The corporate proceeding and marital discovery overlap now. Mercer thinks we have grounds. Adrian looked through the glass wall of his office at a company Ethan had once helped keep alive. How long? 30 days. Maybe 60. 60 days before Ethan could leave legally. 60 days to keep him in discovery, keep him answering questions, keep the marriage technically alive. The old Adrian would have called it time. The new truth made it look like captivity. "Prepare the motion," Adrian said. His counsel paused. "You want it filed?" Adrian watched the draft arrive in his inbox. "Prepare it," he repeated. He did not say file. That evening, Ethan came to Vale Meridian for the compelled document conference. Richard's motion had forced him into the building he had spent years avoiding. Employees recognized him. Some looked away. Others had already heard enough rumors to stare. Ethan kept walking. Adrian met him outside the conference room, but did not touch him. "I'm sorry you had to come here." Richard wanted pressure. "This is pressure." Inside, Richard's attorneys displayed the old transfers on a screen as if generosity itself were suspicious. They asked when Ethan and Adrian became romantically involved, when Ethan first believed Vale Meridian might become valuable, whether he expected marriage, whether he expected access to Adrian's lifestyle. Ethan answered each question with controlled precision. Then Richard's attorney put the $12 million current valuation of the Brooklyn property on screen. You surrendered an asset now worth approximately $12 million for Mr. Vale's benefit. Are you asking this panel to believe you expected absolutely nothing in return? Ethan looked toward Adrian. Not for rescue. Adrian understood that immediately. Ethan was checking whether he would interfere. Adrian stayed seated. Ethan turned back to the attorney. I expected him to survive what was happening to him. Emotionally, financially, personally, both. And later you married him. Yes. And later you enjoyed the benefits of his wealth. Adrian's hand tightened beneath the table. Ethan's voice remained even. I also enjoyed breakfast with him. That doesn't mean I bought breakfast 8 years earlier as an investment in future toast. One board member almost smiled. Richard's attorney did not. Then why conceal the payments? Ethan's expression changed. This was the question Adrian had chased through every document. Because Adrian was surrounded by people who made every act of help into leverage. I wanted mine to be the one thing he never had to repay. The attorney leaned forward. Yet your secrecy allowed him to believe you contributed far less to the relationship than you did. Ethan went quiet. When he answered, the room lost its adversarial rhythm. Yes. Adrian looked at him. Ethan continued. I thought if I had to show him receipts to prove my love had value, then we had already lost something more important than money. He glanced at Adrian once. Eventually I realized we had. That was the closest Adrian had come to understanding why Ethan stopped defending himself. It was not because Ethan stopped caring what Adrian thought. It was because every demand for proof became proof of the problem. Richard appeared by video for the final minutes. Touching, he said. But none of this changes governance. Adrian finally spoke. No, it changes mine. He opened the continuance motion on his tablet. Mercer had prepared it exactly as requested. One signature, and the divorce could be delayed for weeks. Richard knew it too. File it, Richard said. Keep the marital discovery open and you keep access to Ethan's records. We resolve the board question before anyone signs anything. Ethan looked at Adrian. This time he was asking something without words. Not whether Adrian loved him. Not whether Adrian regretted the accusation. Whether, when given power over Ethan's exit, Adrian would use it. Adrian picked up the stylus. For 1 second, everyone in the room expected his signature. Then he pressed delete. The divorce proceeds on schedule. Richard's face changed. Don't be stupid. Ethan's marriage is not collateral for my company. Adrian turned to general counsel. Withdraw the continuance request. If the board needs testimony, it gets mine. If there are consequences, they're mine. Richard's voice sharpened. You could lose the acquisition. Then I lose it. Ethan stared at him. The power in the room had shifted again, but Adrian did not reach for the advantage. He simply closed the tablet. Hours later, outside the building, Ethan stopped beside the waiting car. You may have cost yourself a major deal. I know. And you didn't do it to make me stay? Adrian swallowed. I wanted to. Ethan's eyes held his. Adrian forced himself to finish. But wanting you to stay doesn't give me the right to make leaving harder. For the first time since the divorce began, Ethan's expression softened without immediately closing again. Then his phone vibrated. He read the message and handed it to Adrian. The final settlement conference had been confirmed for 9 the next morning. No continuance. No corporate hold. No procedural escape. Ethan took the phone back. Tomorrow, I'm signing. Adrian nodded, though the words visibly hurt. Ethan opened the car door, then paused. If you have something left to say to me, Adrian, tomorrow is the last time I'm going to sit across that table as your husband. The door closed between them, leaving Adrian with less than 14 hours and one final choice. Arrive at the divorce hearing trying to win Ethan back, or finally prove he understood that loving him meant allowing him to walk away. Adrian arrived at the settlement conference with no repayment agreement, no continuance motion, and no plan to ask Ethan to stay. Instead, he placed one signed document beside the divorce papers before Ethan entered the room. Mercer read it first. You're accepting full responsibility for the historical disclosure issue. Yes. This gives the board everything it needs to close Ethan out of the governance review. That's the point. Mercer studied him. Richard may use it against you. Then he uses it against me. When Ethan entered, Adrian did not explain the document. He simply slid it across the table. Ethan read the first page, then the signature. What is this? Richard wanted your money to become evidence against you. I'm removing the reason he has to keep using it. At what cost? That's mine to deal with. Ethan looked at him sharply. Adrian caught himself. Not because you owe me for it. Because Vale Meridian was my responsibility. Before Ethan could answer, Mercer's phone rang. Richard's counsel had received the filing. Within minutes, Richard himself joined the conference remotely, furious. Withdraw it, he said. Adrian remained seated. No, you're admitting a governance failure to protect a man who is divorcing you tomorrow. Today, Ethan corrected. Richard ignored him. You understand what this could cost? Yes. Then stop behaving like a guilty husband and start behaving like the man who built Vale Meridian. Adrian looked at the screen. A week earlier, that sentence might have worked. His company had been the proof he used for almost everything. Judgment, discipline, worth, power. Now the old ledgers had shown him something he could no longer unsee. I didn't build it alone. Richard went silent. Adrian continued. You were ready to take it apart. Ethan stopped you. He protected my control and asked for none of it. So whatever happens to my position now, you don't get to turn his sacrifice into leverage again. Richard's expression hardened. Without the marital discovery, you lose access to records you may need for the board defense. Then I lose access. And the acquisition? If it dies, it dies. Richard stared at him for a long moment, then gave a humorless smile. All this for love. Adrian looked at Ethan. No, that's the part one finally understand. He turned back to Richard. Doing the right thing doesn't buy me love. Richard had no useful answer to that. His leverage depended on Adrian valuing control above consequence. Once Adrian stopped, the mechanism failed. Mercer muted the call after Richard's counsel requested a recess. 10 minutes later, confirmation arrived. With Ethan formally excluded from the governance dispute and Adrian accepting responsibility for the historical disclosure, Richard was withdrawing the motion to compel Ethan's financial testimony. It was not a clean victory. Adrian still faced the board. The acquisition was still uncertain, but Richard had lost control of Ethan's exit. Mercer placed the divorce agreement between them. We can proceed. Ethan looked at the signature line. Adrian did not. Before we sign, Ethan said, I need you to understand something. Adrian nodded. Okay. The money wasn't why I filed. I know. Do you? Ethan's voice remained calm. Because for years, every disagreement about money ended the same way. You paid more, so you thought you risked more. You earned more, so you thought you understood more. And when you became afraid I wanted what you had, you trusted that fear faster than you trusted me. Adrian took the words without interrupting. Ethan's eyes dropped briefly to the old waiver Mercer had included among the supporting records. I made mistakes too. I kept believing that love only stayed pure if I never asked anyone to recognize what it cost me. I had things I should have told you. I made myself invisible, then resented you for not seeing me. That was new. Not forgiveness. Not shared blame. But truth without armor. Adrian leaned forward slightly. Why did you stop defending yourself? The question had followed him from the first day. Ethan finally answered it without looking away. Because the first time you questioned my motives, I thought I could reassure you. The second time, I thought I could wait for you to know me better. By the time you called me a gold digger, I realized I could put every receipt I had ever paid on the table, and it still wouldn't fix the thing that was broken. Trust. Yes. The main mystery was finished. Ethan had not stayed silent because he was ashamed, manipulative, or waiting for the perfect moment to reveal his sacrifice. He had stopped producing evidence because he no longer wanted a marriage in which love required evidence. Adrian looked at the divorce agreement. I came here last night thinking I needed one perfect thing to say so you wouldn't sign. Ethan's face tightened slightly. And now I think asking you not to sign would be one more way of making my fear your responsibility. Ethan said nothing. Adrian continued. I love you. I want you to stay. I want another chance so badly that part of me still wants to take those papers and tear them in half. His hand rested near the agreement, but never touched it. But wanting you doesn't give me a claim on you. Ethan's eyes shone, but Adrian did not move closer. So sign if that's what you need, Adrian said. I won't punish you for it. I won't delay it. I won't make you prove what you gave me ever again. Ethan looked down at the papers. And the 6 million? Off the table. That surprised him. You're not going to try to repay me? If there's ever something legally yours, your attorney can deal with mine. But I'm done pretending a wire transfer can settle what happened between us. Ethan let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, except there was too much grief in it. That may be the first intelligent thing you've said all week. Adrian smiled despite himself. Low bar. For one brief second, they were not billionaire and supposed gold digger, creditor and debtor, accuser and accused. They were simply two men who remembered how to speak to each other. Then Ethan picked up the pen. Adrian's smile disappeared, but he did not stop him. Ethan signed. The scratch of ink across paper was almost absurdly quiet for something that ended 6 years of marriage. Mercer turned the agreement toward Adrian. This was his final test. He could still refuse. He could force litigation. He could create months of delay. Everyone in the room knew it. Adrian took the pen and signed beneath Ethan's name. The old marriage ended because both men chose to let it end. Ethan stared at the signatures for several seconds. You really let me go? Adrian swallowed. I'm trying to finally hear you. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, some of the distance was still there, but the contempt Adrian had feared was not. I don't know if I can forgive you, Ethan said. I know. I don't know if there's an us after this. I know that too. And you're not going to ask? Adrian shook his head. Not today. Ethan stood. So did Adrian. They faced each other across the table where money had first been used to measure their marriage and where, finally, neither man was keeping score. Ethan picked up his copy of the divorce agreement, then paused beside the old ledger marked paid in full. His fingers rested on it for a moment. Funny, he said quietly. That was the easiest debt in this room. Adrian looked at the ledger, then at him. Yeah. Ethan walked toward the door. This time Adrian did not chase him. But before Ethan stepped into the hallway, he turned back. For what it's worth, what you did with Richard mattered. Adrian stayed where he was. I didn't do it so it would. Ethan held his gaze, and something shifted. Not reconciliation, not yet, but the first fragile possibility that trust might someday exist where obligation had ended. Then Ethan left with the divorce papers in his hand, and Adrian remained beside the closed ledger, finally understanding that the financial debt had been paid 8 years ago. The cost of what he had broken was only beginning to come due. The divorce became final 3 days later, and Adrian did the one thing Ethan had spent years believing he could not do. He let the consequence stand. There was no emergency motion, no private offer through attorneys, no apartment transferred into Ethan's name, no replacement for the Brooklyn property, no check disguised as an apology. When Mercer sent the final decree, Adrian read it alone in his office, closed the file, and went downstairs to face Vale Meridian's board. He accepted the governance finding attached to the old disclosure failure. The acquisition was delayed. His authority was formally reviewed. Richard lost his remaining leverage over Ethan because Adrian refused to reopen the marital records. None of it destroyed the company. None of it felt like victory either. But for once, Adrian accepted a loss without trying to purchase his way around it. Ethan learned about that from Mercer, not from Adrian. That mattered. Adrian had not sent him a message saying what he had sacrificed. He had not presented another invisible invoice and waited for gratitude. For nearly 2 months, he sent nothing except what the divorce required. Ethan used the silence differently than he once had. He found an apartment that was smaller than the home he had shared with Adrian and entirely his. He recovered his grandmother's watch from the marital property inventory and placed it on his kitchen counter the first night. It was the only thing he had specifically asked to keep. For years, Ethan had measured the purity of love by how little evidence he left behind. Now he began measuring his life by something else, whether he could state what he wanted without apologizing for wanting it. When his attorney asked if he wanted to pursue any additional equitable claim connected to the old payments, Ethan said no because he chose no, not because he needed his sacrifice to remain invisible. That difference was small on paper. To Ethan, it was enormous. Then, almost 10 weeks after the divorce, a plain envelope arrived from Mercer's office. Inside was no money. There was one document. The original ledger from the divorce investigation, released now that the governance review had closed. Across the oldest debt entry were the same words that had cracked their marriage open, paid in full. Beneath it, Mercer had attached a note explaining that both parties could authorize destruction of the duplicate historical files now that no proceeding required them. Ethan stared at the ledger for a long time. Then he called Adrian. They met the following afternoon at Mercer's office, in the same conference room where Adrian had once accused him of wanting his fortune. The room looked disappointingly ordinary. Same table, same windows, same muted city beyond the glass. But there were no attorneys between them this time. Adrian looked different in ways Ethan could not immediately name. Not poorer, not defeated, simply less armored. You could have authorized this without me, Adrian said, touching the file. I know. So why didn't you? Ethan sat across from him. Because I'm done making decisions for both of us and calling it love. Adrian absorbed that without trying to turn it into hope. Okay. Ethan opened the ledger. I used to think not telling you was the generous thing. No debt. No leverage. No score. You were trying to protect me. Partly. Ethan looked at him. I was also protecting myself. If I never asked to be seen, I never had to risk asking and hearing no. Adrian's eyes lowered. And I made sure you heard no anyway. Yes. No softening. No punishment. Just truth. Adrian nodded. I'm sorry. Ethan had heard apologies from him before. This one was different because nothing followed it. No but. No request. No promise that Adrian could make everything right. Ethan turned another page. There was the property sale, the emptied portfolio, the escrow transfer, the debt release. Numbers that once seemed capable of proving everything. Do you still think you owe me? Ethan asked. Adrian considered the question. I think I'm responsible for what I did to you. That isn't what I asked. Adrian almost smiled. No, I don't think I owe you a marriage. And I finally understand you don't owe me forgiveness. Ethan nodded. Good. Adrian looked at the ledger. Do you regret it? Selling Brooklyn? Any of it? Ethan glanced toward the window. I regret disappearing inside my own idea of what love was supposed to look like. I regret thinking sacrifice only counted if nobody knew about it. Then he looked back at Adrian. But helping you? No. I loved you. I made that choice freely. I'm not going to turn it into a weapon now just because you hurt me later. Adrian's face tightened with emotion, but he did not look away. That was the final reversal Ethan needed. The man who once believed money determined who held power was sitting in front of proof that Ethan could have used as permanent moral leverage. And Ethan was refusing that power too. Not because he was invisible anymore. Because he no longer needed either submission or superiority to know his own value. Adrian reached for the authorization to destroy the duplicate records. What happens after we sign this? Ethan asked. Adrian's hand stopped. Months earlier, he would have searched for the answer most likely to keep Ethan close. I don't know. Ethan watched him. That scares you. A lot. Good. Adrian laughed softly. You've gotten mean since the divorce. I've gotten honest. I like honest. Careful. For the first time, Ethan smiled. It was brief, but real. They signed the authorization. Mercer's assistant collected the duplicate files, leaving only the original ledger on the table. Adrian stood first. Can I ask you something that has nothing to do with money? Depends. Coffee. Ethan raised an eyebrow. That sounded like a noun, not a question. Adrian tried again. Would you have coffee with me? Today. Today. No promises about tomorrow. Ethan looked at the man who had once tried to turn fear into certainty, then at the empty space where the settlement folders had been. One coffee. Adrian nodded. One coffee. 6 months later, they had not remarried. That was important to both of them. Adrian had stopped treating reconciliation like an acquisition with a closing date. Ethan had stopped treating need as weakness. They argued sometimes. The difference was that Ethan spoke before resentment became silence, and Adrian listened before fear became accusation. When Adrian paid for dinner, it was dinner, not evidence of who provided more. When Ethan asked for something, he asked directly. No invisible sacrifices. No secret tests. No score. On the anniversary of the day the divorce became final, they returned to Mercer's office for one last reason. The governance retention period had expired, and the original ledger could finally be released. Ethan held it while Adrian waited beside him. Keep it? Adrian asked. Ethan looked at the words paid in full, then tore the page cleanly through the middle. Adrian blinked. I thought you might frame that. Why? Ethan tore it again. So I can win arguments. Adrian smiled. It would be devastating evidence. Exactly. Ethan dropped the pieces into the secure disposal bin. Then he took Adrian's hand, not because a court still called them husbands, not because Adrian's fortune required repayment, and not because sacrifice entitled either man to another chance. He took it because trust, unlike debt, could only exist when both people were free to leave and chose, day by day, not to. They walked toward the elevator together, leaving the ledger behind. 8 years earlier, Ethan had paid Adrian's debt and asked for nothing in return. Now Adrian finally understood why the easiest words in their entire story had always been the ones printed across that old account. Paid in full.